In my last video, I began the process of making an enclosure for my new Crested Gecko. I recommend you watch that video before this one if you haven't already. It explains a little more about her, as well as how I turned this 40-gallon breeder into a vertical enclosure. Like I said in my last video, this is a two-part series on how I made her enclosure. Part 1 was making the enclosure itself, while Part 2 will be the background, hardscape, and planting. Yet again, I'm using the same background technique. I will be experimenting with different background techniques in the future, however this is a safe, reliable option. It's fairly cheap and looks amazing. As usual, I'll be cutting the foam with a knife, snapping it along the edge of a table, and drawing on the pattern with a Sharpie. About halfway through cutting the outlines, I realized it wasn't necessary. You'll see why later. Same goes for cutting out the stuff in the middle and carving the edges of the foam. I finally found a different technique to carve it. I'm using a wire brush drill bit, and let me just say, this thing has made a world of difference. I used to spend about half an hour with the knife, but with this drill bit, it only takes 10. Not only is it faster, but it gives me a much better texture. The texture looks something like a tree bark, which is exactly the look I wanted. After all the carving was done, I started to paint it with Drylock. You know the drill by now. I start with a thick base coat, followed by progressively lighter dry brush coats. I went all out with this one using 4 different colors of Drylock, whereas my last few I've used 2 to 3 colors. It was definitely worth the other color because these things look amazing. Now to get them installed in the tank. I put silicone on the sides of the tank and pressed them firmly into place. I also went back with another bead of silicone to seal up the corners and make everything look cohesive. Once everything was dry, I could start painting the silicone. I'm using the same 4 colors of Drylock that I used for the background and applying them in the same way, applying a thick base coat and progressively lighter dry brush coats. After everything was painted, I could finally start scaping it. I'm using a few random pieces of driftwood that I got from a local fish store. I'm just pushing them into the foam now, but I'll attach them permanently later. I also added a few plant pots within the branches, as there won't be any substrate up here. There's no water in this setup, so all the plants will need substrate to live. It took me a few hours, but I finally got the scape. I'm really happy with the way it turned out, and I think it'll make a great place for her to climb. As I said earlier, I'll be attaching the wood permanently. To do this, I'm using Great Stuff Gaps and Cracks expanding foam. Once this stuff is cured, I'll carve it so it matches the background. applying the foam where the wood meets the background, even though some of the wood would be fine on its own. Anyway, with the foam applied and cured, I can start to carve it. There's really no technique to carving here. All I'm trying to do is thin it down and shape it a bit. After I got the carving done, I started to paint it to match the background. Here's the final product. It looks amazing and you can barely tell that there's even foam there. Before I continue, I vacuumed out the bottom of the tank to remove foam and other debris. Then I moved the tank onto the stand. With the tank on the stand, I can begin to make the false bottom. To start, I measured a piece of acrylic light diffuser and cut it with wire cutters. Once all the pieces were cut out, I assembled them with zip ties. I then used the wire cutters to cut the ends of the zip ties. After that, I covered the entire structure with window screen mesh and more zip ties. I also used a box knife to cut off the excess mesh. Again, I used wire cutters to cut the zip ties. After the structure was finished, I put it in the tank. I'll also add a little bit of leca around the edges. Not only will it look better from the front, but it'll also absorb some of the water that collects in this area. The purpose of a false bottom is so that whenever you mist or water plants in the tank, it collects down here instead of the substrate. I also added a piece of mesh over the false bottom to ensure that substrate doesn't fall into it. I left about a 2-inch gap on each side of the mesh, that way it's easier to separate the layers. I also added some charcoal. This helps absorb any sitting water and prevents odors and bacteria buildup. Now onto the substrate. For this I'm using 4 different components including cocoa fiber, reptile bark, sphagnum moss, and play sand. My goal here was to create a substrate that retains humidity while also not collecting a lot of water. Anyway, once the substrate had been mixed up, I could start to put it in the tank. I also added some to both the pots. Finally, onto the plants. I started by removing them from the pots and breaking up the soil from the roots. rinsed off any remaining dirt. Once all the plants were prepared, I started adding them to the tank. To be honest, this took me quite a few tries. I've never worked with something completely terrestrial like this, so I had to keep going back and forth between stores and getting more plants. I kept buying them and putting them in the tank, and they just weren't doing well. I had a rough idea of plants that would work, but it took me a while to fine-tune it. Like I said, I've never worked with something completely terrestrial before, but it's all part of the learning experience. Also, there was one bromeliad that wasn't in soil or a pot, so I made a little bag of substrate for it, and it should work fine. To make the bag, all I did was get a small piece of mesh, put some substrate in it, and secure it with a zip tie. Bromeliads are one of the plants I've had great success with. They do well in substrate or water. Alright now, back to planting. Like I said earlier, it took me a while to get the plants, so most of the plants you see now will be a bit different from the end product. Now on to the cleanup crew. I have a few springtails and powder blue isopods. They'll help address mold and other bacteria. For lighting, I'm using a Nicrew Classic LED Plus. These have a cool feature that allows you to dim or brighten the lights over the course of 15 to 30 minutes, which makes for a really nice day to night transition. I also added a few under tank heaters to finish up the project. And there it is, the 40-gallon Crested Gecko Vivarium. Even though I've never done something completely terrestrial before, this is definitely my favorite tank I've made. But I want to know what you think. Let me know down in the comments. Anyway, that's all I have for this one. Don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.